The Declaration of Independence is the foundational document in America. It's foundational historically, it's foundational theoretically.
The core of the meaning of the Constitution is expressed in the Declaration of Independence. That's the apple of gold.
There's a very definite sense in which the Declaration has been and remains foundational for American politics.
The task of each generation is to recommit itself to the truths of the Declaration.
Without the Declaration, the United States would no longer be essentially the United States.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence. In it, we find the vision of a free society, not one based on hierarchy, class, or race. The truths it affirms are said to be universal because they are derived from our shared nature as human beings. Moreover, it sets out the first principles of political life for the United States. And in this sense, it is the soul animating the political life of the American people. One could say that the Declaration, even more than the Constitution, lays the foundation for the political order we live in today. At the time of the founding, there was widespread agreement among Americans that the truths enunciated by the Declaration were, in fact, true. But a problem loomed, one that the founders were keenly aware of. This was slavery, an institution whose existence squarely contradicted the principles of the Declaration. Indeed, as some are quick to point out, many of the founders, including the primary author of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson, were themselves slave owners. Over the course of the antebellum era, the controversy over the institution of slavery would only grow, and the fate of the Declaration, not to mention the truths it asserted, was very much at stake. What began as a contradiction eventually became a political crisis of the first order, resulting in the Civil War. So how did the founders understand the Declaration and its relationship to slavery? Did they in fact see it as a contradiction? And how did the founders view the institution of slavery itself? We put these and other questions to 5 of America's leading scholars of American political thought. Here's what they had to say.
It is the contradiction at the heart of the American founding. Nobody denied that that was a contradiction and a problem. And the Declaration of Independence itself sets up the problem. Once you come to the Declaration of Independence, and once you come to the idea that we are naturally equal and equal in our rights, then slavery becomes a problem, and only then.
Scholars have often wondered how it is that a group, many of whom, and many of the most significant members of which were themselves slaveholders, could have signed with a clear conscience a document that asserts the equality of human rights.
I think the founders saw that there was a flat and all-out contradiction between the practice of slavery and the principles on which we were founded. They were very aware of that contradiction, and it's not only the leading founders who are aware of that contradiction, but ordinary people in this time period were very aware of the contradiction between American principles and American practice.
Some people have argued that the founders were simply obtuse. You know, we have a tendency to ignore awkward facts, so we conceal these things from ourselves. I think that's demonstrably wrong.
They always said slavery, as Jefferson continued to say that slavery was contrary to the Declaration. But sure, you look at some of his letters, and it's not as if he was addressing this problem with any urgency. So I think that there's grounds for criticism, especially when you look back. They didn't solve the problem, the founding generation. It remains their great failure. Maybe it was insoluble. It was only through the spilt blood of hundreds of thousands that this issue came to an end with the Civil War. And even then, another generation and another century was required before the scourge of slavery was fully eliminated.
The founders saw slavery as incompatible with the principles of right that they had endorsed in the Declaration of Independence and in many other documents of the era. They saw it to be a moral wrong. They thought it was less easy to figure out how to make it a right, that is, how to fix the problem, but they definitely saw it as a wrong, or at least the leading founders did.
I think the simplest and most accurate formulation is to say that they regarded slavery as a necessary evil. So it was an evil, they branded it as an evil, but they also believed that because of the long continued existence of slavery, it was a necessary evil. It was an evil that they didn't know how to free themselves from, at least not immediately or quickly.
By the 1820s, we see a change in attitudes towards the institution of slavery, particularly in the South. What accounted for this change?
In the 1820s and 1830s, you see a distinct change in America. You see people starting to make an argument that slavery isn't a necessary evil, something to be tolerated for a time, but that it's actually a positive good. I think there are a variety of different factors going on here. Historians often will point to changing economic interests in the South. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 makes cotton a cash crop and king in the South, and so now slave labor becomes extremely valuable, and you have an economy built upon it. You have a changing generation now. Now we're in the 1820s and 1830s, and the founding generation is passing. And you have a new generation in which the revolutionary principles are waning, and a commitment to those principles has been waning.
The Confederates really understood, at least the leading sort of Confederate theorists, really understood themselves as at the cutting edge of science. Progressive science indicates that there is a hierarchy of races, that the whites are at the top of the heap, and there are these other inferior races that aren't entitled to the same rights.
So an argument grew up that a natural law, meaning a scientific proposition, validated the inequality of the races.
And the argument is that we are naturally unequal, that there are natural inequalities, and that any solid foundation for political life will be rooted in those natural inequalities. And in this kind of perverse way, you actually have a defense in some of the arguments of white equality being underwritten by black inequality.
It seems to me that in the formation of opinion in the South, probably the more significant figure is John C. Calhoun.
Calhoun is special because he brings logical rigor to the whole discussion. He tries to say the whole premise of the Declaration of Independence is sheer assertion that can't withstand the light of day once you look at it logically.
John C. Calhoun was an American politician, one of the leading intellectual defenders of slavery from South Carolina, and he argued against the Declaration of Independence openly. He understood this to be something that he called a false and pernicious doctrine, that all men are created free and equal, and as he says, in the not less erroneous way in which that phrase comes up in the Declaration of Independence. And so he argues against it. He says that this is actually the root cause of all of the evil things that are going on in the United States, all of the political disagreements, all of the sectional strife and crisis is at bottom rooted in this teaching of the Declaration of Independence. And so Calhoun defends a conception of political order that's founded on and rooted in natural inequalities.
The philosophical controversy quickly became a political controversy. Just as the South now had its thinkers and spokesmen who began to openly defend slavery and denounce the Declaration, so too the North had its defenders, most prominently Abraham Lincoln. What were the key events in the growing conflict over slavery? What claims did each side advance? And what arguments did Lincoln make as he labored to reestablish the principles asserted in the Declaration?
The Missouri Compromise, remember, had banned slavery in the Louisiana Purchase territory. In 1854, some of those territories, the Nebraska territory, out of which actually both the states of Kansas and Nebraska were formed, it was time to begin to organize those territories in preparation for their admission into the Union. Stephen Douglas, the famous Democratic senator, was the one who led the move to organize the Nebraska territory. What he did, though, was something rather stunning. Instead of leaving that Missouri Compromise intact, he decided to abandon it.
Douglas, in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, put in place a principle that would allow the states that are carved out of these territories to vote whether or not to be slave or free. And so it replaced the principle of freedom in these territories with the principle of popular sovereignty, and popular sovereignty with respect to slavery, whether or not to have slavery. And as Stephen Douglas repeatedly said, he didn't care whether or not the people voted for slavery. And so he professed a policy of not caring about slavery one way or the other, but simply wanting the people to be able to decide.
After all, the old states in the Union had slavery. Why shouldn't these other states have the same freedom to have it or not? Let the people decide.
Stephen Douglas was the most prominent Democrat, say from the 1830s or 40s on. Was the great senator from Illinois, a tremendous orator. He was short, so he was known as the Little Giant, but a great orator. And what's not known also is that Stephen Douglas was an important thinker as well.
Imagine the challenge for Lincoln, running against a very accomplished politician, a very successful senator, Stephen A. Douglas. Imagine trying to make an argument against popular sovereignty while still expecting to be elected. It's a task.
Lincoln always took that idea to task. He said that you couldn't have a right to do a wrong, that there couldn't be a right for popular majorities to enslave other people, that implicit in that principle was the idea that those who were being enslaved were not part of the people. There was a certain kind of dehumanization that took place. At one point he said that the real question involved here is whether or not the slave is or is not a man. And if he is a man, then he said that his ancient faith teaches him that all men are created equal. It was never a matter of indifference whether or not people had slavery. And the principle of popular sovereignty for Lincoln, as it applied to this issue, was wrong. It was wrong because it got human nature wrong. It was wrong because it devalued the people who were enslaved. It was wrong because it taught people that majorities were unlimited, that they could do anything that they wanted to do. And for Lincoln, there were limits to what majorities could do.
Lincoln fell back on the principles of the Declaration as a way of inserting into the national debate that this is not an amoral issue. This was an issue that touched the core of what America was all about. Lincoln said, there's some things that you can't not care about. And this is one of them. And it's central to who we are and what we are. But this is America. And we bring a different standard to political life. That's what we are about. Suddenly, the Declaration of Independence emerges full-grown, alive, vibrant, relevant, decisive in thinking about who we are. And the political debate takes on a whole new character.
In March of 1857, the Supreme Court comes out with a decision in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. And the decision, at least the one that we remember as the court's decision, is written by Chief Justice Roger Taney.
What Taney said was that the statement in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal doesn't really apply to all men. It really was meant to apply only to white men or Europeans or some class of people lesser than the totality of all human beings.
First, he says that African slaves and their descendants are not citizens of the United States and can never become citizens of the United States, whether slave or free. And so, according to Taney's ruling, even free blacks cannot become citizens of the United States.
So the Dred Scott decision really created a firestorm. It was regarded by many as a travesty of justice. Frederick Douglass actually called it a devilish decision and a judicial incarnation of wolfishness.
So Lincoln was driven in his response to the Dred Scott case to very much deny Taney's attempt to say that this is only about white men. Lincoln says, look at the words. That's not what the language of the Declaration says, in fact.
This is one of those things where Lincoln said, okay, all these things have conspired against the black man and black woman being recognized as human beings. Science has come down against it. And now the law says this is permanently inferior status, and there's no future for a person who is not white in the political system of the United States.
Lincoln was faced with a great problem, how to present the doctrine of natural rights to the American people in the 1850s. No one was reading John Locke anymore, I assure you. The electorate was broader. It didn't consist of an elite who had studied political thought as some had in the founding generation. How to make the teaching of natural rights understandable to the American people. That was Lincoln's, I'd say, challenge. And so he used a variety of different techniques to, in a way, recreate the reasoning, some of the reasoning of Jefferson and Locke, but in a new and more popular way.
It's Lincoln's enormous achievement that he was able to counter that point of manifest human inequality in all kinds of respects with the fundamental equality that no one has a right to eat the bread that I earned by the sweat of my brow.
As he said to the people, look at a person who's enslaved. They don't get to keep the produce of their own labor, the fruit of their own labor. How would you like to live in that situation? Would you ever choose that situation? Well, you could say, the white person could say, yeah, maybe that's not so just, but I'm white, that person's black. Then he started another chain of reasoning. Suppose you're somewhat dark-skinned. Who's to say maybe you'll start drawing the line with people whose skin isn't quite as light? Look around and begin to think that maybe other people could become enslaved. He tried to bring home the proposition that slavery could slide from those of the black race to people of mixed race and eventually people of lighter skin. And in bringing this reasoning home, anyway, he recreates the idea of the social contract without the abstraction in ways people understand. The whole point is that this is the idea that you're self-evidently equal. No one in that position would ever agree to that situation where their labor was taken without their consent, where they were enslaved by others. To make all feel that equally is to make them understand what equality was.
Despite the efforts of Lincoln and others, war and disunion could not be averted. The Civil War is often viewed as a second founding, or a rededication of America to its original principles. In what sense could the Civil War be viewed as a refounding of the nation? And what role did Lincoln's Gettysburg Address play in the restoration of the Declaration's vision of a free society?
The Gettysburg Address makes foundational the Declaration of Independence in ways that exceed whatever it had been before. And interestingly enough, the Gettysburg Address becomes itself foundational.
As he says, 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And so in Lincoln's interpretation, he goes back to the Declaration of Independence as the foundational moment in which America is, as he says, conceived in liberty, brought forth on this continent. And it's dedicated to this proposition. This becomes central then for Lincoln.
In those few words, those few sentences, Lincoln infuses a new grand vision of what America can be. But he does it in the form of recovering what America was. America has to be reconstituted, as it were, in terms of its basic principles.
So much of what we think about now in terms of the relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution, the Declaration and the nation, is a result of Lincoln's retelling of this story. And so in all sorts of different ways, the Gettysburg Address becomes a moment of refounding, or at least a moment of re-anchoring to our foundings.
Lincoln argued that what the Declaration did was to set forth a standard maxim for a free society. A standard maxim is something that sets the ideal, something that we will constantly strive for, constantly work towards, that we will constantly approximate. And Lincoln said that the Declaration had the power to augment the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. It really shows what he believed to be the world-changing and universal significance of the Declaration.
We remember the Declaration because it's our founding document, but if you think back on the whole history of this document, you come, I think, to the conclusion that it wouldn't be quite as important for us if it were not for Abraham Lincoln. He took the document to the Declaration. He explained it in broader and more popular terms. He made it part of our national poetry. But more important, in the practical cauldron of the politics of the 1850s, he sought, and I think succeeded, in saving the Declaration from its decline. His idea was that the Declaration was under threat. It was being attacked from all sides. He was worried that it would cease to exist, and at least cease to exist as the first document in the minds of Americans. And after all, when you change the direction of a country, its first principles, you change what a country is. So in Lincoln's view, without the Declaration, the United States would no longer be essentially the United States.
The Declaration of Independence, to the extent that it's present to our minds as a guiding principle, a foundational element of our very national identity, raises the tone of it all in this special sense. It wouldn't matter if ultimately China has a greater gross domestic product than America. There's something else that America has and has had from its national beginning in which we can take pride and identify with. And that's one of the great accomplishments of Lincoln in bringing that element of what we should really be proud of, that we're restoring that through this new birth of freedom, in which the Declaration of Independence would never simply be irrelevant or forgotten.
These things are, as Lincoln said, our national axioms or dogma. It's this beginning, the starting point for us. They are foundational in that sense. They're held out as self-evident truths. But of course they can be denied. They're contested. They have been contested throughout our history. And so as we reflect on them, do we care whether or not they're true? I think we should. I think these are important claims. They're claims that we are created equal, endowed by our Creator with these inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Whether or not those ideas are true makes a world of difference for whether or not we should be committed to them, whether or not we should continue to be committed to them. And so that's a vital question that we have to think through and argue about and debate and continue to wrestle with.
We've only scratched the surface in our exploration of the history and meaning of the Declaration. To learn more about the Declaration of Independence, go to the Jack Miller Online Resource Center. Thanks for watching.